The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Samuel Thompson adjusted his thick glasses and shuffled through another stack of paperwork. At 28 years old, he had spent the last 6 years of his life buried behind a desk in the administrative wing of Fort Marshall, filing reports, organizing supply requests, and maintaining personnel records. His fellow soldiers often joked that Samuel knew more about the Army through paperwork than most field officers knew from actual combat experience. Samuel was not the type of man anyone would pick out of a crowd. Standing barely 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a slight frame, thinning brown hair, and clothes that always seemed a size too large, he blended into the background of military life like wallpaper. His voice was soft, almost whisper-quiet, and he rarely spoke unless directly asked a question. The other clerks had grown accustomed to his presence, treating him more like a piece of office furniture than a fellow human being. On this particular Tuesday morning in March 1943, the usual routine was interrupted by the sharp sound of boots marching down the corridor. General Harrison Matthews, a man whose reputation preceded him into any room, strode purposefully toward the administrative offices. His steel-gray hair was perfectly combed, his uniform immaculate, and his jaw set in the determined expression that had earned him respect from both his superiors and subordinates. Behind the general walked his aide-de-camp, Captain Richards, struggling to keep pace while balancing a leather portfolio and what appeared to be urgent dispatches. The sound of their approach caused every clerk in the office to straighten their shoulders and pretend to be deeply engrossed in their work, though their ears strained to catch any hint of why the general himself had come to their humble corner of the base. Samuel continued typing on his mechanical typewriter, the rhythmic clacking of keys providing a steady soundtrack to the tension that had suddenly filled the room. He had learned long ago that drawing attention to himself rarely led to positive outcomes. Better to remain invisible, complete his tasks efficiently, and return home each evening to his small apartment where he could read his books about military history and strategy in peace. General Matthews stopped in the center of the office, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room as if he were surveying a battlefield. The man had a presence that seemed to fill every corner of the space, making even the most confident soldiers feel like they were under a microscope. Captain Richards positioned himself slightly behind and, to the right, ready to take notes or relay orders as needed. "Gentlemen," the general's voice boomed across the office, causing several clerks to nearly jump out of their chairs. "I have a situation that requires immediate attention, and I need someone with very specific qualifications." Samuel's fingers paused over the typewriter keys for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. He had heard the general speak at base assemblies before, but never in such close proximity. The man's voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of men in battle and made decisions that affected the lives of countless others. "I need someone who understands the intricate details of our supply chains, someone who has studied our personnel files extensively, and, most importantly, someone who can think on their feet when presented with complex logistical challenges," General Matthews continued, his gaze moving from face to face around the room. The other clerks began to sit up straighter, each one hoping they might be selected for whatever important mission the general had in mind. Working directly with General Matthews would be a career-making opportunity, the kind of assignment that could transform a lowly clerk into someone with real influence and responsibility. Samuel kept his head down, focusing intently on the supply manifest he was typing. He knew his colleagues well enough to predict that Thompson from accounting would probably volunteer first, followed by Jenkins from personnel. Both men were more outgoing than Samuel, more comfortable speaking up in group situations, and more likely to catch the general's attention. This assignment will require someone to work independently, often under difficult circumstances, and make critical decisions without the luxury of consulting superiors, the general added, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. The success or failure of this mission could significantly impact our current operations in the European theater. The weight of his words settled over the office like a heavy blanket. This was not going to be a simple administrative task or a routine assignment. Whatever the general had in mind would require genuine courage, intelligence, and the ability to perform under pressure. Samuel found himself wondering what kind of mission could possibly require such specific qualification from someone. In the administrative corps, General Matthews walked slowly around the office, his hands clasped behind his back as he continued his explanation. The tension in the room had grown so thick that Samuel could practically feel it pressing against his skin. Every other clerk in the office was sitting ramrod straight, desperately hoping to make eye contact with the general and demonstrate their readiness for whatever challenge lay ahead. "The situation is this," General Matthews began, stopping near the window that overlooked the training grounds. "Our intelligence reports indicate that there is a significant problem with our supply distribution network in the northern sector. Medical supplies, ammunition, and food rations are not reaching our forward positions as scheduled. Men are going without essential resources, and morale is beginning to suffer." Captain Richards nodded grimly as he made notes in his leather portfolio. Samuel noticed that the captain's usually steady hand was trembling slightly as he wrote, suggesting that even senior officers found the general's presence intimidating. "What makes this situation particularly troublesome," the general continued, turning back to face the room, "is that our field commanders insist they are following proper protocols. Our supply officers claim they are shipping everything on schedule. Yet somehow, critical materials are disappearing between point of origin and final destination." Thompson from accounting raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, have we considered the possibility of enemy interference? Perhaps sabotage or theft by local resistance groups?" The general nodded approvingly at the question. "An excellent point, Thompson. We have considered that possibility extensively. However, our security sweeps have found no evidence of external interference. The supply convoys are arriving at their scheduled checkpoints with their seals intact and their manifests complete. The problem appears to be occurring after the supplies reach our own distribution centers." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the office as the implications of the general's words sank in. If supplies were disappearing from within their own distribution network, it suggested the possibility of corruption, incompetence, or even treason within their own ranks. Samuel found himself genuinely intrigued, despite his usual preference for staying out of important matters. His years of processing supply requests and tracking inventory movements had given him an intimate understanding of how materials flowed through the military system. He had noticed occasional discrepancies in his paperwork, small irregularities that he had dutifully reported through proper channels, but which had never seemed to generate much interest from his superiors. "The reason I am here personally," General Matthews said, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone, "is that this problem has reached a critical point. Yesterday, a field hospital treating wounded soldiers ran completely out of morphine and surgical supplies. 3 men died who might have been saved if the medical team had access to the materials that should have been delivered 2 days earlier. The weight of human cost behind the logistical problem hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. This was no longer an abstract administrative challenge, but a matter of life and death for their fellow soldiers." Samuel felt a knot forming in his stomach as he thought about wounded men suffering needlessly because someone, somewhere in the system, was failing in their duties. "What I need," the general continued, "is someone who can conduct a thorough investigation without alerting the individuals who might be responsible for these problems. Someone who can blend into the background, observe quietly, and piece together what is actually happening to our supplies." Jenkins from personnel cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, wouldn't this type of investigation typically fall under the jurisdiction of the military police or intelligence services?" General Matthews smiled grimly. "Under normal circumstances, yes. However, we have reason to believe that someone with access to high-level information is involved in these irregularities. A formal investigation by official channels might inadvertently warn the responsible parties and allow them to cover their tracks." Samuel's typing had stopped completely now, though he kept his eyes fixed on his paperwork. The general's description of the mission requirements, was painting a picture that made him increasingly uncomfortable. This was not the kind of assignment that typically ended well for the person brave enough or foolish enough to accept it. The volunteer I select will be given temporary assignment to the Quartermaster Corps in the Northern Sector, General Matthews explained. Officially, they will be conducting a routine audit of supply procedures. Unofficially, they will be investigating every aspect of the distribution network to identify where and how our supplies are being diverted. The general paused and looked around the room expectantly. This assignment will be dangerous. If someone is indeed stealing military supplies during wartime, they will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose them. The volunteer will be working alone, without backup, and without the protection of official authority. The office fell completely silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant sounds of military training exercises outside. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he realized that every other clerk in the room was probably hoping someone else would volunteer first. However, General Matthews added, his voice taking on a note of encouragement, the person who successfully completes this mission will have performed a genuine service to their country and their fellow soldiers. They will have helped ensure that critical supplies reach the men who need them most, potentially saving countless lives. Samuel glanced up from his typewriter for the first time since the general had entered the office, and found himself making direct eye contact with the most intimidating man on the entire military base. The moment of eye contact lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Samuel. General Matthews studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read a person's character through their expression. Samuel felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment and quickly looked back down at his typewriter, but the damage was done. The general had noticed him. "You there," General Matthews said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. The clerk at the typewriter. "What's your name?" Samuel's throat went completely dry. He could feel every eye in the office turning toward him, and he wished desperately that he could simply disappear into his chair. "Thompson, sir," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "Samuel Thompson." "Speak up, Thompson," the general commanded. "How long have you been working in administration?" Samuel cleared his throat and tried again, his voice still shaky but slightly louder. 6 years, sir. I started here right after basic training." General Matthews walked over to Samuel's desk, his polished boots clicking against the linoleum floor with each measured step. Up close, the man seemed even more imposing, his presence filling Samuel's entire field of vision. The general picked up one of the supply manifests from Samuel's desk and examined it carefully. "This is very detailed work," General Matthews observed, running his finger down the columns of numbers and descriptions. "Every item accounted for, every quantity verified, every destination properly coded. How familiar are you with the overall supply chain process?" Samuel found himself speaking more confidently as the conversation turned to his area of expertise. "Very familiar, sir. I process requests from 17 different units, track shipments through 4 distribution points, and maintain records for everything from medical supplies to ammunition. I also prepare the weekly summary reports that go to the Quartermaster General's office. Have you ever noticed any irregularities in the paperwork?" General Matthews asked, his tone becoming more serious. "Discrepancies between what was ordered and what was delivered. Unusual patterns in the distribution schedules." The question hit Samuel like a thunderbolt. He had noticed irregularities, dozens of them over the past 2 years. Small things that individually seemed insignificant, but which had gradually formed a pattern in his mind. He had reported some of them through proper channels, but most had been dismissed as clerical errors or explained away by his supervisors. "Yes, sir," Samuel said quietly. "I have noticed some things that seemed unusual." General Matthews leaned forward slightly, his attention now completely focused on Samuel. "What kind of things?" Samuel glanced nervously around the office, acutely aware that his colleagues were hanging on every word. "Well, sir, there have been several instances where the shipping manifests show full deliveries, but the receiving reports indicate that only partial shipments arrived. When I brought these discrepancies to my supervisor, I was told that the receiving units must have made errors in their paperwork. How often does this type of discrepancy occur? Captain Richards asked, stepping forward with his pen poised over his notebook. More frequently in recent months, Samuel replied, gaining confidence as he discussed the details he had been tracking in his own informal records. I started keeping personal notes about 6 months ago because I was curious about the pattern. The discrepancies seemed to be concentrated in shipments going to 3 specific distribution points in the northern sector. A look passed between General Matthews and Captain Richards that Samuel could not interpret, but which seemed significant. The general straightened up and clasped his hands behind his back again, studying Samuel with renewed interest. "Thompson," General Matthews said slowly, "you mentioned that you keep personal notes about these discrepancies. Do you still have those records?" Samuel nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I keep in my desk drawer. I thought someone might want to see them eventually, so I documented everything with dates, shipment numbers, and unit designations." The general smiled for the first time since entering the office, though the expression was more approving than warm. "Show me these records." Samuel opened his desk drawer with trembling hands and pulled out a small notebook filled with his careful handwriting. He had been meticulous in his documentation, recording not only the discrepancies, but also his own theories about possible explanations. As he handed the notebook to General Matthews, he realized that he had been conducting his own unofficial investigation without even realizing it. General Matthews flipped through the pages quickly, his eyebrows rising slightly as he reviewed the extent of Samuel's documentation. "This is excellent work, Thompson. Very thorough and well-organized. How did you learn to conduct this type of analysis?" Samuel felt his face reddening again. "I read a lot of books about military logistics and strategy, sir. In my spare time, I find it interesting to understand how all the different parts of the system work together." "What books?" Captain Richards asked, apparently genuinely curious. "Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, some modern works about supply chain management," Samuel replied, surprised by his own boldness in continuing the conversation. "I also study the historical examples of how logistics failures affected major military campaigns." General Matthews closed the notebook and looked directly at Samuel. "Thompson, I believe you may be exactly the person I need for this assignment. Your attention to detail, your understanding of the supply system, and your ability to recognize patterns make you uniquely qualified to investigate these irregularities." Samuel felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his ankles. The last thing he had intended was to volunteer himself for a dangerous mission by demonstrating his competence. "Sir, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for field work. I've never been involved in anything more challenging than organizing filing systems." The weight of General Matthews' words settled over Samuel like a heavy coat. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues burning into him, some with envy at being passed over, others with relief that they had escaped notice. The general continued to study Samuel's face, apparently waiting for a response that Samuel was not sure how to give. "Sir," Samuel began hesitantly, "what would happen if I discovered that someone really is stealing supplies? I mean, what would I be expected to do about it?" "Your job would be to gather evidence and report back to me personally," General Matthews replied. "You would not be expected to confront anyone directly or take action beyond observation and documentation. Think of yourself as my eyes and ears in the field." Captain Richard stepped forward and addressed Samuel directly. "The general is offering you an opportunity to make a real difference, Thompson. Lives are literally hanging in the balance here." Samuel looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. Everything in his nature screamed at him to decline politely and return to the safety of his desk job. He was not a brave man, not a natural investigator, and certainly not someone who belonged in dangerous situations. Yet something deeper was pulling at him, a sense that this might be his one chance to prove that he was more than just a quiet clerk who filed papers and typed reports. "If I agreed to do this," Samuel said slowly. "How would the assignment work exactly?" General Matthews smiled again, and this time the expression seemed genuinely pleased. "You will be transferred temporarily to the Quartermaster Corps at Distribution Center 7 in the Northern Sector. Your official assignment would be to conduct a comprehensive audit of their supply procedures and inventory management systems. This would give you legitimate access to all the records, facilities, and personnel involved in the distribution process. You would have a small office, a desk, and all the authority you need to examine any documents or ask any questions related to supply management," Captain Richards added. "From the outside, you would appear to be just another bureaucrat doing routine paperwork." Samuel found himself thinking through the logistics of such an assignment. "How long would I have to complete the investigation?" 2 weeks, General Matthews replied. "Long enough to establish patterns and gather solid evidence, but not so long that anyone becomes suspicious of your presence. A 2-week audit is completely normal and expected." The general pulled a chair over to Samuel's desk and sat down, bringing himself to eye level with the nervous clerk. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter and more personal. "Thompson, I'm not going to lie to you about the risks involved. If someone is indeed stealing military supplies during wartime, they are committing treason. People who commit treason are typically willing to go to extreme lengths to protect themselves." Samuel swallowed hard. "You mean they might try to hurt me if they figured out what I was really doing?" "It's possible," General Matthews acknowledged. "However, I believe your natural demeanor and appearance would provide excellent camouflage. You don't look like an investigator or a threat to anyone. Most people would probably assume you're exactly what you appear to be, a harmless clerk doing routine administrative work." The office had grown so quiet that Samuel could hear the general's watch ticking. Every person in the room was waiting for his answer, and he realized that his next words would determine the entire direction of his life. He could decline politely and return to his safe, predictable routine, or he could step into the unknown and attempt something that terrified him. "Sir," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happened to the men who died because they didn't get their medical supplies?" General Matthews' expression grew grave. "Private Johnson, age 19, died from infection that could have been treated with antibiotics that never arrived. Sergeant Williams, 24 years old with a wife and 2 children, bled to death during surgery because there was no plasma for transfusions. Lieutenant Morrison, 22, died from complications that developed when the surgical team couldn't access the proper instruments." Each name hit Samuel like a physical blow. These were not abstract statistics, but real people who had died needlessly because someone somewhere in the system had failed in their duties. He thought about the careful records he maintained every day, how each number on his manifest represented actual supplies that real soldiers depended on for their survival. "There's something else you should know," General Matthews continued. "Intelligence reports suggest that this supply theft operation may be much larger than we initially suspected. If our theory is correct, the perpetrators may be stealing supplies not just for personal profit, but to sell to enemy forces. Every bullet, every medical kit, every piece of equipment that disappears could end up being used against our own troops." The implications of this revelation made Samuel feel sick to his stomach. The idea that American soldiers might be killed or wounded by their own stolen supplies was almost too horrible to contemplate. He looked around the office at his fellow clerks, all of whom seemed to be holding their breath as they waited for his decision. "General Matthews," Samuel said, his voice growing slightly stronger, "if I take this assignment, what resources would I have to help me? Would I be completely on my own? You would have direct communication with Captain Richards through coded radio transmissions twice daily," the general replied. "You would also have access to my personal authority if you need to override local resistance to your investigation. Beyond that, yes, you would essentially be operating alone." Samuel closed his eyes and thought about the 3 soldiers who had died unnecessarily. He thought about his comfortable desk job, his quiet apartment, his books about military strategy that he read like adventure novels. He thought about the possibility that he might actually be able to make a real difference, to save lives instead of just processing paperwork about other people who saved lives. When he opened his eyes, General Matthews was still watching him intently, waiting for an answer that would change everything. "I'll do it, sir," Samuel said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I'll take the assignment." The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. General Matthews stood up and extended his hand to Samuel, who shook it with as much confidence as he could manage. Captain Richards began making rapid notes in his portfolio, and several of Samuel's colleagues looked at him with expressions ranging from admiration to complete bewilderment. "Excellent," General Matthews said, his tone becoming briskly professional. "Captain Richards will brief you on the specific details this afternoon. You'll depart for Distribution Center 7 tomorrow morning. Your cover story is that you're conducting a routine efficiency audit at the request of the Quartermaster General's office." Samuel nodded, trying to absorb the reality that his life had just changed completely in the span of a single conversation. "What should I tell my supervisor here? And my colleagues?" "Tell them exactly what your cover story says," Captain Richards replied. "You've been selected for a temporary assignment to conduct an audit at another facility. This type of transfer happens regularly, so no one should think it's unusual." General Matthews picked up Samuel's notebook of documented discrepancies and handed it back to him. "This will be invaluable reference material for your investigation. Continue documenting everything you observe with the same attention to detail you've shown here." Over the next hour, Captain Richards provided Samuel with detailed briefings on his mission parameters, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. Samuel learned that Distribution Center 7 was located in a small town about 200 miles north, that he would be staying in temporary quarters on the base, and that he would report directly to the facility commander under the pretense of conducting his audit. "Remember," Captain Richards emphasized, "your official mission is completely legitimate. You really will be conducting an audit of their supply procedures. The investigation is secondary and must remain completely covert. If anyone asks, you're just a clerk doing routine administrative work." Samuel spent the rest of the day in a strange state of alternating excitement and terror. Part of him could hardly believe that quiet, unremarkable Samuel Thompson was about to undertake a secret mission that could affect the outcome of military operations. Another part of him was convinced that he had made a terrible mistake and would somehow manage to ruin everything. That evening, as he packed his few belongings into a small suitcase, Samuel reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in a single day. For 6 years, he had been invisible, overlooked, treated as just another piece of office equipment. Now, suddenly, his skills and observations were considered valuable enough that a general had personally selected him for a critical assignment. The train ride to Distribution Center 7 the next morning gave Samuel plenty of time to review his mission materials and try to calm his nerves. He studied the facility layout, memorized the names and positions of key personnel, and rehearsed his cover story until he could recite it naturally. By the time the train pulled into the small station near the base, he felt as prepared as possible for what lay ahead. Distribution Center 7 turned out to be larger and busier than Samuel had expected. Trucks constantly arrived and departed. Soldiers moved supplies in organized formations, and the air buzzed with the efficient activity of a well-run military operation. On the surface, everything appeared to be functioning exactly as it should. Samuel's assigned office was small, but adequate, with a desk, filing cabinets, and access to all the records he would need for his audit. The facility commander, Colonel Peterson, welcomed him cordially and assured him that his staff would provide full cooperation with the audit process. Everyone Samuel met seemed professional, competent, and genuinely committed to their duties. For the first 3 days, Samuel found absolutely nothing suspicious. The paperwork was properly completed, the inventory levels matched the records, and the distribution schedules were being followed precisely. He began to wonder if the discrepancies he had noticed in his own office were simply clerical errors after all, and if General Matthews had sent him on a wild goose chase. On the fourth day, everything changed. While reviewing shipping manifests in the records room after normal working hours, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. A pattern was emerging that was so subtle and carefully concealed that it would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent years studying supply chain documentation with obsessive attention to detail. Someone at Distribution Center 7 was indeed stealing supplies, but they were doing it with a sophistication and systematic approach that indicated extensive planning and inside knowledge. The theft operation was not the work of opportunistic individuals grabbing whatever they could carry, but rather a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that involved multiple people in positions of authority. Samuel's hands trembled as he made careful notes of his discoveries. He had found evidence of exactly what General Matthews had suspected, but the scope and organization of the operation was far beyond anything he had imagined. As he worked late into the night, documenting shipping discrepancies and inventory irregularities, Samuel realized that he had stumbled onto something that could potentially change the course of the war. More importantly, he had discovered that the quiet clerk who had spent 6 years being invisible was capable of far more than anyone, including himself, had ever suspected. General Matthews had been right about one thing. Sometimes the most effective operatives were the ones who did not look like operatives at all. Samuel Thompson, the unremarkable administrative clerk with thick glasses and a whisper-quiet voice, had just become the most important person that no one noticed. And tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to expose a conspiracy that threatened the lives of countless soldiers without getting himself killed in the process. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Samuel Thompson adjusted his thick glasses and shuffled through another stack of paperwork. At 28 years old, he had spent the last 6 years of his life buried behind a desk in the administrative wing of Fort Marshall, filing reports, organizing supply requests, and maintaining personnel records. His fellow soldiers often joked that Samuel knew more about the Army through paperwork than most field officers knew from actual combat experience. Samuel was not the type of man anyone would pick out of a crowd. Standing barely 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a slight frame, thinning brown hair, and clothes that always seemed a size too large, he blended into the background of military life like wallpaper. His voice was soft, almost whisper-quiet, and he rarely spoke unless directly asked a question. The other clerks had grown accustomed to his presence, treating him more like a piece of office furniture than a fellow human being. On this particular Tuesday morning in March 1943, the usual routine was interrupted by the sharp sound of boots marching down the corridor. General Harrison Matthews, a man whose reputation preceded him into any room, strode purposefully toward the administrative offices. His steel-gray hair was perfectly combed, his uniform immaculate, and his jaw set in the determined expression that had earned him respect from both his superiors and subordinates. Behind the general walked his aide-de-camp, Captain Richards, struggling to keep pace while balancing a leather portfolio and what appeared to be urgent dispatches. The sound of their approach caused every clerk in the office to straighten their shoulders and pretend to be deeply engrossed in their work, though their ears strained to catch any hint of why the general himself had come to their humble corner of the base. Samuel continued typing on his mechanical typewriter, the rhythmic clacking of keys providing a steady soundtrack to the tension that had suddenly filled the room. He had learned long ago that drawing attention to himself rarely led to positive outcomes. Better to remain invisible, complete his tasks efficiently, and return home each evening to his small apartment where he could read his books about military history and strategy in peace. General Matthews stopped in the center of the office, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room as if he were surveying a battlefield. The man had a presence that seemed to fill every corner of the space, making even the most confident soldiers feel like they were under a microscope. Captain Richards positioned himself slightly behind and, to the right, ready to take notes or relay orders as needed. "Gentlemen," The general's voice boomed across the office, causing several clerks to nearly jump out of their chairs. "I have a situation that requires immediate attention, and I need someone with very specific qualifications." Samuel's fingers paused over the typewriter keys for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. He had heard the general speak at base assemblies before, but never in such close proximity. The man's voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of men in battle and made decisions that affected the lives of countless others. "I need someone who understands the intricate details of our supply chains, someone who has studied our personnel files extensively, and, most importantly, someone who can think on their feet when presented with complex logistical challenges," General Matthews continued, his gaze moving from face to face around the room. The other clerks began to sit up straighter, each one hoping they might be selected for whatever important mission the general had in mind. Working directly with General Matthews would be a career-making opportunity, the kind of assignment that could transform a lowly clerk into someone with real influence and responsibility. Samuel kept his head down, focusing intently on the supply manifest he was typing. He knew his colleagues well enough to predict that Thompson from accounting would probably volunteer first, followed by Jenkins from personnel. Both men were more outgoing than Samuel, more comfortable speaking up in group situations, and more likely to catch the general's attention. This assignment will require someone to work independently, often under difficult circumstances, and make critical decisions without the luxury of consulting superiors, the general added, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. "The success or failure of this mission could significantly impact our current operations in the European theater." The weight of his words settled over the office like a heavy blanket. This was not going to be a simple administrative task or a routine assignment. Whatever the general had in mind would require genuine courage, intelligence, and the ability to perform under pressure. Samuel found himself wondering what kind of mission could possibly require such specific qualifications from someone in the administrative corps.